Hello, my name is Sean Briscoe, and in this presentation I will give you the Cliff Notes version of an Introduction to Student Congress or Congressional Debate. The presentation is primarily aimed at those individuals who are brand new to judging or brand new to judging congressional debate, just to give you some insight into what is going on in the debate round. So, congressional debate is loosely modeled after what we would hope to see on the floor of the United States Congress. The students will debate various pieces of legislation, whether they be bills or resolutions. Bills would have the force of law. Resolutions would be statements of belief from the chamber. And at the highest levels of competition, it would probably take students, or it usually takes students, about an hour to debate a single piece of legislation, although on many less experienced circuits or local circuits, you may find that the students will progress through 2 or 3 pieces of legislation per hour. But while they're engaging in that debate, they're going to follow parliamentary procedure, making various motions, using pretty formal decorum as they approach the topic, which is, I think, good in that it's not only helping the students to understand argumentation and debate, as we would learn in other formats of debate, but it also introduces them to the procedures for running a formal meeting. Because it is a debate, we will alternate back and forth from the pro side to the con side, or the affirmative to the negative, and back and forth through these various pieces of legislation. At most tournaments, the speech lengths are 3 minutes, so you'd have a 3-minute affirmative speech, and then a 3-minute negative speech, and then back over to the affirmative side again. A lot of tournaments also incorporate cross-examination periods, but what those cross-examination periods look like will vary from tournament to tournament and circuit to circuit, league to league. Some tournaments will have 1-minute or 2-minute cross-examination periods after every speech. Some tournaments will only have cross-examination periods after the first speech from the pro and possibly the first speech from the con. And then once the students have exhausted debate on a particular piece of legislation, they will actually vote to either pass or not pass that piece of legislation. Now, as a judge, whether or not a piece of legislation passes or not by the chamber, it really doesn't affect your decision because you're evaluating the contributions to the debate, not necessarily how the students are voting in that debate. So when it comes to your evaluation, what are you looking at? Well, in a nutshell, you're evaluating the students' contributions to a good debate. You are looking at each and every member of the chamber, and depending on the tournament, there could be as few as 8 competitors in the chamber or as many as 30. And you're going to look at all of them and identify those who did the most to develop the debate, who fostered a good debate, who developed our understanding of the issues. And you will identify them on a ballot. Most tournaments have the judges identify the top 8 competitors in the chamber and rank order those 8 individuals first, second, third, and fourth. Now, how do you know who's contributing to a good debate? Or what are you looking at? I've identified what I think are the 4 primary ways that students contribute to a good debate. There are other ways that they can contribute, such as through good, on-point cross-examination questions, meaningful motions, and those types of things. But for the most part, the 4 main ways that students will contribute are through authorship or sponsorship speeches, and that's really just the first affirmative speech. The subsequent constructive speeches, summary speeches on each piece of legislation, and then serving as presiding officer. So let's look at each of those in turn a little bit. So the first type of speech that you would see in a congressional debate round is a sponsorship speech or an authorship speech. This is simply the very first pro speech on a piece of legislation. The duty of that speaker is to prospectively frame the debate for you and for the other participants in the chamber. That means they're looking at the piece of legislation, which you should have a hard copy in front of you, and all of the debaters should have a hard copy in front of them. Or maybe it's on a tablet or something like that, but they've got the legislation in front of them. The speaker who's giving the sponsorship speech may need to illuminate or expand upon anything that might be confusing in that piece of legislation to help us understand why that legislation exists, and clarify any meaning that's maybe unclear. But then they also want to identify the central issues that should be related to this debate. Why is this piece of legislation pertinent? Why is it important? Why is it timely? They may identify those things in the round so that we can all see where the debate is likely to head. Now, that speaker does not need to identify each and every issue related to the topic. They do not need to necessarily go into tons and tons of depth, because their primary responsibility is simply to introduce us, to get us thinking in the right direction. Then you would move into constructive speeches. And this is the vast majority, or these are the vast majority of speeches that take place in congressional debate. After that sponsorship speech, you're going to have the first con speaker or the first negative speaker, and then back over to the second affirmative, second negative, third negative, and so on. Each constructive speech has two primary responsibilities, or two aspects of it. The speaker needs to, first of all, deconstruct the previous speaker. That means they're listening to the material that the person who came before them delivered to the chamber. They're looking at it, they're analyzing it, and they're finding the key critical weakness in that argument and expressing that to you, helping you to understand why that argument should not be compelling or why it isn't compelling. Sometimes they may engage in some debate to say that, well, maybe that issue just isn't as important as the issues on my side of the legislation or something like that. But the point is, they need to engage with the previous speaker. In a 3-minute speech, that's typically going to take that person about 30, maybe 45 seconds to do. And then the second aspect is that the individual needs to add something new to the debate. They need to help us understand more about the debate topic. And there are a number of different ways that they can add something new. They can bring in a new pragmatic principle, help us to understand the actual implications of passing the legislation. They might bring in a philosophical principle, why this is something that we should be concerned about. They may provide the theoretical studies or the political theory behind a piece of legislation, whether it's coming from the world of sociology, political science, international relations, what have you. They might provide a case study of where something like this has been done in the past, and maybe in another country. Like I said, in the past, maybe it's been done in a local community, in a state, or someplace, and they can actually say, look, this is what happened when something was passed that was similar to this piece of legislation, and they can examine that. The point being that each of these constructive speakers needs to not only engage the previous individual, but they also need to add some relevant material to the debate, help us to understand it in a new way. I think one of the critical things for us to look at when we see constructive speakers is it's not enough to just simply use a shotgun approach and identify 5, 6, 7 different issues on the topic. They need to pick one and develop it. But also protect yourself a little bit in terms of thinking about how students are doing this. Just because a previous speaker mentioned something doesn't mean that they developed that point. And so it's okay to latch on to something that was said earlier and really develop that point in the constructive speech. That would fulfill their burden of adding something new to the debate. The third type of speech is a summary speech or a whip speech, where as the debate is starting to exhaust, as we've started to repeat ourselves, or we've hit all the central issues related to a piece of legislation, someone from both sides of the topic, pro and con, should give a summary speech to highlight what the key arguments were, what the key issues were, to assign priorities to those different issues, and help us to understand which ones are most important and why. And hopefully they're even going to reach back and identify the members of the chamber who did the most to contribute to the understanding of those particular issues. That's essentially what I just said. So you can look at those, identifying central principles, critical arguments, etc. And hopefully they're also encapsulating all of the significant aspects of the debate. If they're leaving out key contributions, key aspects of the debate, they've probably missed what's been going on, and maybe that's a weaker speech. And then the last way that someone in the chamber can contribute is by serving as the presiding officer. The presiding officer, who is usually a student competitor, has a critical role in the debate. They need to ensure that there's a fair chamber, that all of the speakers are given an opportunity to speak. You don't want to reward someone who is catering to their friends or a certain part of the room. Hopefully they're spreading the wealth and allowing everyone to contribute equally and fairly. And then they also should be promoting an efficient chamber or running an efficient chamber. If we get bogged down in a lot of extraneous motions, if there's a lot of disruptions, maybe the presiding officer isn't doing his or her job to maintain order in the chamber, and you should take that into effect. Now, I do want to highlight that it is almost always going to be the case in which the presiding officer makes the top 8 ranking. Presiding officers have a critical role in the debate and are almost always rewarded with being ranked on the final ballot by the judge. That being said, it is unusual for the presiding officer to be ranked in the top 2 in that chamber. And that's just because, yes, they have a critical role, but they're not giving speeches, they're not developing the ideas, and so while they have an important role, they're not usually the top person in the chamber or even the second best person in the chamber. So just keep that in mind as you're filling out your ballot at the end of the round. And then again, like I said earlier, your role as the judge is simply to look at all of those members of the chamber and evaluate their contribution to a good debate. Identify the top 8 contributors and put them on the ballot in order of best, second best, etc.